I don't want to hurt your feelings. But the truth is, you've never mattered all that much to me.
If there's one thing that Vince Gilligan is great at, it's creating characters with pathos. Tragic individuals that we as an audience can't help but feel sorry for, despite the fact that they sometimes do bad or even truly terrible things. In Breaking Bad, there were numerous characters that fit the bill, most notably Walter White, possibly one of the most infamous TV characters of all time. In Better Call Saul, Jimmy McGill, aka Saul Goodman, has himself become a character that's endured a lifetime of tragic circumstances, mistakes, and failure. Despite all this, Jimmy, much like Walter White, is a remarkably talented individual. He started out as a silver-tongued conman, grifting people in bars, but after getting in trouble with the law, he tries to live a more honest life and is inspired by the success of his older brother Chuck to become a lawyer. Chuck is essentially the antithesis to Jimmy. He plays by the rules and he beats people over the head with those rules until he's successful, especially Jimmy. Chuck is everything that Jimmy isn't. Most notably, he's accomplished a tremendous amount in his lifetime and has become very wealthy as a result. Jimmy has lived under the shadow of Chuck since they were children, and it's clearly always been a massive burden not being able to live up to the standard he set. Despite all this though, Jimmy is still loved by all, and his gift for talking to people has made him extremely affable. His personality is more akin to a warm, fuzzy pillow, whereas Chuck's is more akin to a cold, hard-edged slab of concrete. Both have their purpose, but there's only one that people really like to get close to. Throughout the first 3 seasons of Better Call Saul, the conflict between Jimmy and Chuck is the driving force of the series, and it's easily one of the most compelling relationships we've seen in TV show. If you'll excuse the somewhat lazy comparison, it's much like the story of Cain and Abel, one brother constantly competing to best the other. Jimmy is unscrupulous in his fight against Chuck, knowing that people like him often have to resort to what many would consider the wrong thing in order to best his brother, but as Kim would put it,
he'd make quite an adversary. The kind of adversary who'd find even the smallest crack in your defense.
So with the 5th and penultimate season of Better Call Saul just around the corner, we're almost at the point where Jimmy McGill is no more and Saul Goodman takes over. I think now is a good time to ask, how did this happen? I'm going to go over a few moments that we've seen in Jimmy McGill's life that contributed to him becoming Saul Goodman and the tragic loss of Jimmy McGill.
Everything that happened was his own fault. Everything. You put him in the rearview mirror. He is not worth thinking about. Done.
I think to understand how Saul Goodman came into being, we have to look at the person that he was in Breaking Bad. From the moment we're introduced to him, we can tell that he's a person that's not on the level. He works out of a strip mall with people looking to make accident claims almost always sitting in his waiting room. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there is a stereotype of the lawyers that chase ambulances just to make money from the vulnerable. When we first see him, he's almost a cartoonish image of a shady lawyer, from the toupee to the pinky ring and a tacky, over-decorated office. Very quickly though, we also learn that even though he may not seem it, Saul Goodman is a very wealthy person, and he's earned his money through helping people like Walter White and Jesse Pinkman, criminals who have a tremendous amount of dirty money to spare, and Saul doesn't put morality aside to take it. He's found a system in which someone like him can profit immensely from his talents by helping anyone willing to pay for him. In the past, we've also seen that he was no stranger to criminal activity, given his history with grifting people, but he also had a moral arbiter in his brother Chuck. Now, to get this out of the way early, Chuck's death at the end of season 3 was not the reason Jimmy became Saul. It was a contributor, but not the driving force. Throughout Jimmy's life, Chuck, along with their father and Kim, had always been the ones to remind him that if he remains on the straight and narrow path, that he'll eventually find success and satisfaction. But as he's learned time and time again, this isn't necessarily the case, that doing the right thing doesn't always yield the best results, how sometimes taking another path can be more rewarding, and how doing things a way that you've been told not to don't always harm people. Jimmy and Chuck were taught by their father from an early age that they must live the most honest life possible, a lesson Chuck learned and stood by his entire life. He even referred to his dad as the personification of good, but Jimmy didn't. Their dad ran a small convenience store which struggled financially and inevitably ended up closing. When it was open, Jimmy was regularly stealing from the cash register, taking around $14,000 over the years, therefore contributing to the store's closure. He wasn't completely to blame for this though, as we learned that, as Jimmy says, his father was a complete pushover. He would lend money to anyone in the neighborhood that came in with a sob story. Jimmy may have been embezzling from the store, but he also knew his father was a naive person who refused to believe that even his own son was capable of doing such a thing, even after Chuck told him that he'd been stealing. This was a formative experience for Jimmy. He learned that being good can come at a tremendous cost, that while morality might be emotionally rewarding, it's not always financially compensated. In one scene we see Chuck Sr. dealing with a local grifter in a store who tells them that their car has broken down and he needs spark plugs and money. Jimmy tries to warn him, but his father refuses to believe that the man isn't honest. However, when Chuck Sr. walks into the back of the store, the man reveals to Jimmy that he is indeed grifting them. And from that moment on, Jimmy realizes that the ideology of the grifter is far more rewarding than that of a righteous person. Not only did Jimmy learn that an honest life isn't always a rewarding one, he learned the pain of failure, having witnessed his father's business struggle for years. After their dad, Chuck Sr., passed away, shortly after the store closed down, Chuck essentially took on the responsibility of keeping Jimmy on the straight and narrow, but it didn't work out. Chuck went on to become a lawyer and Jimmy continued grifting. It's not that Jimmy isn't intelligent enough to go to university himself, far from it. But much like the real-life conflicts between siblings or even parents, having someone close to you who's so incredibly successful might not necessarily be a motivator, but a burden. Jimmy has always felt the pressure to be as good as Chuck, but he's divided. There's a part of him that wants to be like him and live up to his standards, and the part of him that finds a thrill from getting away with doing the things he's told not to, or taking shortcuts and still getting results. I think one of the sad things about Jimmy is that he's very clearly an exceptional and driven person, but he lives in a world with other people that constantly tell him that what he needs to do is colour within the lines, and that doing so will ultimately benefit him. But despite this, whenever he tries to do the right thing, he constantly suffers from setbacks. In the early seasons of Better Call Saul, we see Jimmy trying to live an honest life. He graduated from a correspondence school and became a public defender, working to help people who've been accused of small crimes. The job pays almost nothing. He drives a run-down Suzuki Esteem, and he has a tiny office in the back of a spa which he also lives in. To add to all this, Chuck has taken an indefinite break from his old law firm which he helped found after he developed electrohypersensitivity, a mental illness which makes people experience severe discomfort from being around electronic devices and radio wave signals. Every single day before work, Jimmy has to do what he can to help out his brother, delivering newspapers, food, drinks, ice and oil for his lanterns. It's clearly exhausting and fruitless work to keep up with this kind of life, and it makes it all more worse to know that despite Chuck having a tremendous amount of influence in his law firm, he won't hire Jimmy because despite of everything that he's done to keep his life together, he still doesn't see him as worthy enough to uphold justice. Later on, Jimmy discovers that once again he has value among criminals. He tries his best to steer clear of them and remain on the path set by Chuck, but due to a series of circumstances, he eventually ends up involved with individuals that are far more dangerous than any he's encountered before, and it's impossible to avoid them. In other words, just as he thought he was out, they pull him back in. On a thematic level, Better Call Saul explores themes similar to those I discussed in my recent video about Parasite, which deservedly won the Best Picture Oscar, and rightfully so, about how skill and talent isn't always properly rewarded, and this isn't a struggle exclusive to Jimmy in the story. Kim, Mike, and even Nacho are all very gifted and intelligent individuals who are constantly set back by the desire to do the right thing. They've all faced their fair share of moral conflicts too. Kim is a straight-laced, somewhat tightly wound personality who constantly reminds Jimmy that he needs to stay honest. But we see her on occasions enjoying a massive high from grifting with Jimmy. And Mesa Verde Bank, her first major personal client, was convinced to work with her largely due to Jimmy's altering of documents to convince them not to go with Hamlin, and McGill, a fact that she learns about later on but decides to begrudgingly live with because it benefits her. On the other hand, Mike is fully aware of the potential consequences of doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, which we learn after he recounts his heartbreaking story about how he convinced his son to take money from dirty cops in order to show that he wasn't a rat, but they killed him anyway, believing that he was going to snitch. Quick side note, Jonathan Banks is an incredible actor. Please give him more awards.
It was for nothing. I made him lesser. I made him like me.
Throughout his life, Jimmy has clearly had some kind of morality. He knows the difference between wrong and right, but he also knows how to get away with things, even if that doesn't always work out like he expected. He understands that people value his talent and his personality, and that they admire him for turning his life around, but he encounters setbacks far more often while doing the right thing than when he does wrong. Possibly the most profound moment in the show, and possibly Jimmy's life, is when in Season 3, Episode 5, arguably the best episode of Better Call Saul yet, he finally bests his brother. Chuck secretly recorded Jimmy confessing to tampering with official documents. He has to testify in court to verify the validity of this confession with the intention of having Jimmy disbarred, except things don't go quite as well as Chuck expected. Far from it. Not only does Jimmy defeat Chuck, but he does so at his own game. Jimmy once again plays dirty and Chuck knows this, but he still wins and gets away with it. To make matters worse, this all happens on Chuck's hallowed grounds, the courtroom, in front of all of his friends, family and peers. And not only does he lose to Jimmy, he loses in the most embarrassing way possible. This is Chuck's lowest point, and it's where Jimmy realizes that after all this time he didn't have to aspire to live up to his brother's standards. He just had to take him down, and he did that in a way that he's best at, and something Chuck could never possibly do. This is when Jimmy learns that despite all of Chuck's righteousness and faith in the law, regardless of how much he's built himself up over the years or how respected he is, it doesn't matter anymore. He defeated Goliath by playing by his own rules and by exploiting the chinks in his brother's seemingly impenetrable armor. These few moments in Jimmy's life are just part of a larger tapestry of what led him to becoming Saul Goodman. The show is basically a long, sad story about how good people stop trying to do the right thing because it costs them so much, and it's not limited to Jimmy. Mike and Nacho have their own fair share of moral conflict, but because Jimmy had Chuck looming over him his entire life, he was kept in check, and it wasn't necessarily his death or him losing the court trial that made Jimmy get over that. It was learning that no matter what he accomplishes or how hard he tries to appease him, Chuck will never respect Jimmy. Regardless of all the hard work he did or the love and devotion that he could show, Chuck will never see Jimmy as a peer or even a real brother, and he'll always blame him for everything that went wrong in their lives. I guess after knowing all this, can we fault Jimmy for becoming Saul? I find it hard to do so myself. It's just a shame that the thing that he's great at happens to assist some very dangerous people. Perhaps Jimmy would have been better off in sales, but as someone who's done that before, I assure you it is emotionally draining and unrewarding work. I think Jimmy McGill died because not only did Saul Goodman not want all the moral baggage, but he felt he couldn't be happy living up to the standards expected of his former self. It clearly comes at a cost, because we later see that in Breaking Bad he no longer has Kim in his life, and as far as we can tell he's not spoken for by anyone. And at the opening of every new season of Better Call Saul, we get a look into the events after his troubles with Walter White, where he's living a drab life as a manager of a Cinnabon, in hiding with a fake identity and pining for his life as Saul Goodman. Jimmy McGill genuinely tried to be a decent, law-abiding person. He was a public defender, he helped dozens of elderly people and convinced them to set up a class action lawsuit against the nursing home that was exploiting them. He got a job at a reputable law firm and took the initiative to create an ad for them. He did everything that he could to keep Chuck comfortable, well, and alive. Unfortunately, he would constantly be reminded that there was little to no reward in being good, or he'd feel the need to do things his way once again, even if it was something that would ultimately be beneficial to everyone. Saul living a happy and fulfilling life was contingent on abandoning Jimmy's morality and his need for validation from his peers. It's just a shame that he was never able to find a good balance in Jimmy's life. There's a scene in Better Call Saul that I believe perfectly encapsulates Jimmy McGill as a character. At the end of the first episode of the second season, appropriately titled Switch, Jimmy has started his job at a new law firm. It's a respectable position that comes with his own office, company car, and a big salary. When he's inspecting his new office for the first time, he sees a switch on the wall with a label that emphatically says, "Always leave on, do not turn off." After a few moments of deliberation, Jimmy looks around to see if anyone's looking and flips the switch, only to find out that nothing happens. It shows that Jimmy can't help but be curious about what he can get away with. He's been given this amazing opportunity and a new career and a new life, but the temptation to break the rules still stays with him. It's like the Cherokee legend, where an elderly brave tells his grandson about the battle between two wolves that rages in everyone, one good, one evil. When the grandson asks which one wins, the elder answers, "The one you choose to feed." Unfortunately, the evil wolf was fed too much, and therefore Jimmy McGill died and Saul Goodman was born. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, then I would really appreciate it if you subscribed, liked, commented, etc. all that stuff. If you want to be reminded of any future videos that I release, and of course click on that notification bell. But otherwise, thank you for giving me your time. I really appreciate it. I love doing this, and I love you too. But I hope you have a wonderful day and take care of yourself.